Welcome to today's Skill Up session. My name is Emily Spranger. I'm the manager of the Academic Training Academy at NU, and I'm thrilled to be able to work with Dr. Michelle Marvel. She is a wonderful faculty in our Stanford College of Education here at NU. And this is, by popular demand, coming to you today, Quantitative Research Made Clear, a 10-step guide to planning your study. Very brief Zoom norms here that we would like to go over. We absolutely want you to have conversation in the chat. And if you have some questions that you would like to pose, you can put them in the Q&A. Our Skill Up series is really focused on tips, strategies, and tools for your academic success. If you are thinking of something that you would like to see in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and let me know what you are needing in our series. All of our Skill Up series are going to be housed on our Skill Up YouTube channel, and I will put that link in the chat so you have access to it. We are recording, and you will get a copy of today's session. That being said, those are my Zoom norms that I wanted to discuss with you today. And I'm excited for Dr. Michelle Marvel to dive into today's content, giving us some tips on quantitative research. Dr. Marvel.
So welcome everyone, and I'm very glad that you could join me for today's session on quantitative research. I do apologize, I do have a bit of a cold today, so if I have to pause for a moment, and I've just got some throat drops and things here and some hot tea, and I'll be right back. But whether you are here as a student or a researcher in the early stages of a project, or you are a seasoned researcher, then this presentation is designed to support you. And today's topic is Quantitative Research Made Clear, a 10-step guide to planning your study. And the goal of this session is just to demystify the research planning process. And so what we're going to do is we're going to walk through 10 key steps that will help you to design a study that's not only rigorous and valid, but is also efficient, ethical, and impactful. And so too often researchers feel very overwhelmed when they're moving from an idea to a well-structured study. And so my aim today is to just to help make that process a little bit more manageable and a little bit more accessible, to give you a clear, step-by-step framework that you can return to again and again. And quantitative research is grounded in a structured, systematic approach that emphasizes objectivity, precision, and replicability. It involves the use of numerical data and statistical methods in order to investigate relationships, to test hypotheses, and to draw conclusions that are supported by evidence. And today I will just highlight the best practices and offer some real-world examples and give you some opportunities to reflect and discuss on how these steps might apply to your own research interests. So I'm Dr. Marvel, and I'm truly excited to guide you through this process. So let's begin our journey toward planning a clearer, stronger, and more effective quantitative research project. So we'll start with the basics. What exactly is quantitative research, and why does it matter so much? Now, at its core, quantitative research is a systematic and structured way of investigating the world using numbers. And it gives us the tools to test ideas, to spot patterns, to confirm theories, and to make decisions that are based upon real-world evidence. I think I skipped slides there for just a moment. So it's not just about your intuition. It's whether we're exploring graduation rates, healthcare outcomes, or consumer behavior. Quantitative research helps us just to cut through the noise and really just to get to the facts. And this approach relies on very clear, structured methods like surveys, experiments, and statistical modeling to ensure that what we're finding is both reliable and replicable. And that's really a big deal. In a world that's overflowing with information, the ability to produce credible, consistent, and replicable results is what sets strong research apart. Now, one of the greatest advantages of quantitative research is its power to generalize. So when your sample sizes are large enough and you're using good sampling strategies, then you can find your findings can represent an entire population, not just the group that you studied. And because your process is systematic and transparent, then others can repeat your study and verify the results. And that's really what you want with quantitative research, because that's essential for building confidence in your work. And so this isn't just theory. Quantitative research is everywhere. In education, we might want to test whether a new math curriculum improves standardized test scores. In healthcare, randomized controlled trials are the gold standard because they tell medical researchers whether new medications or interventions are more effective than current standard treatments. In business, data-driven market analysis can tell whether a product is likely to be successful or not. So what really distinguishes quantitative research is its focus on objectivity, precision, and statistical rigor. And it's not about feelings or interpretations, it's about measurable outcomes and reliable comparisons. Now, researchers use standardized instruments and statistical tests like t-test, ANOVA, regression analysis, and tests like that to analyze data and to uncover meaningful relationships. But let's be honest, quantitative research is not perfect. One challenge is that it often lacks context. Numbers can tell us what is happening, but they can't really tell us why it's happening. It may overlook social and cultural nuances or miss the human experience behind the data. And that's where qualitative research can do that. So there are definitely some things to look at. And unless we're using valid and reliable instruments, no matter how big our data set is, then the data can be compromised. So that's very important to make sure that you have that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And it's also why planning is everything. When it's done well, quantitative research is not only powerful, it's very persuasive. It allows you to build a case, influence policy, support innovation, and to make an impact. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through just 10 essential steps that are going to help you to design a quantitative study that is not only methodologically strong, but it's also going to be meaningful and relevant to your field. So let's dive in and let's start building your research toolkit. And let's be honest, planning a research study, it can feel overwhelming at times. If you've been working on a dissertation or dissertation proposal, I consider the whole proposal to be part of the planning process. You're making a lot of decisions right there during that whole proposal phase, which can be very lengthy, and it's all about planning. And there are a lot of moving parts. You have to define your topic, you have to figure out your research questions, you have to choose the right research method, make sure your data collection tools are solid, and all the while you're trying to not make a mistake that's going to just derail your whole project and you have to start making major decisions and really doing some major changes even before your project begins. And if that sounds familiar, you're not alone, because many researchers, especially those who are just starting out, find the planning phase to be the most intimidating part of the process. But here's the good news. When you follow a very clear, structured approach, research planning becomes not just manageable, it becomes strategic, it becomes purposeful, and it can even become energizing because you've got a plan and you know what your next step is. And this presentation is built around a 10-step framework that simplifies the process of designing a rigorous, well-aligned quantitative study. So think of it like a research roadmap, something that you can return to anytime you're just stuck or you're not sure what the next move is. And by the time we are done here today, you should have a clear understanding of how to define a strong research problem that is going to focus your study and identify a measurable gap in the literature. Align your research questions with your hypotheses so that what you're asking and what you're testing fit together logically. Select a research design that supports the kind of results that you want to generate, whether you're testing relationships, comparing groups, or exploring trends, and you'll know how to ensure that reliability and validity in both data collection and data analysis are present, because these are two critical pillars of quantitative research. And most importantly, this session is packed with practical strategies that can help you to avoid some common pitfalls that researchers run into. Things like poorly worded hypotheses, misaligned methods, or measurement tools that just haven't been properly tested. So whether you're preparing a dissertation, maybe you're writing a grant proposal, or it's your first publication, these 10 steps are designed to give you tools to design research that's not just statistically sound, but impactful, research that contributes meaningfully to your field and stands up to scrutiny. So let's dive into that first step and start building a solid foundation for your research study. So we'll begin with what might be the single most important step in the research process. And if you've started on your project or you've been thinking about it, you've already heard, you've got to define your research problem. A strong research problem is not just a formality, it is the anchor for every single thing that follows in your research process. It shapes your research questions, it guides your design, and it gives your study both purpose and direction. Without a clearly defined problem, a study can quickly become scattered, no matter how well executed the other elements are. So what makes a problem strong? Well, it needs to have a few key things. First, it needs to address a clear gap in literature, something that we don't already know or understand fully. And I'm going to say it needs to do a little bit more than that, too. This is something that I often tell my dissertation students. So if you're going to present a problem statement, the best thing to do is to go to the limitations, discussions, and recommendations for future research of the existing articles that you are reading, and make sure those articles are very current and that they are scholarly, peer-reviewed empirical sources. And then look at those and see what needs to be addressed, because having a gap in literature is often not enough. You also need to have a rationale for why this topic needs to be studied further and now. And so if you can find it, again, in the discussion, limitations, and recommendations for future research of those articles that you're already busy reading, and say, can I design a study to address any of these? Because if you can find at least 3 to 5 sources that say something needs to be studied, and you can design a study to address that, then you're well on your way to defining your problem and having those 3 to 5 sources right there that you can support that say this topic needs further study. And then you can really design a solid problem statement. So a gap in literature is not enough. You need to support why it hasn't been studied and why it needs further study with existing literature. Second, it needs to be testable with numerical data for a quantitative study. The goal is to measure and analyze relationships. And finally, it should be relevant and significant, showing why the study matters and how it contributes to the field. So a vague or overly broad problem like, I want to study education, or I'm interested in leadership, makes it nearly impossible to build a focused study. These kinds of statements might be interesting, but they're not specific enough to generate measurable questions, testable hypotheses, and to make appropriate methodological choices. So they're good starting points, but you would need to then go and read literature on those topics and in that field, and then see what needs to be studied and look at theirs. Instead of starting with a topic and then trying to find literature to support it, look at the literature and say, what does the literature say needs to be studied, and build your topic from there, build your problem statement from there. In quantitative research, your problem also needs to be structured in a way that lends itself to statistical analysis. And that means identifying the variables that can be measured numerically and analyzed in a way that leads to concrete evidence-based conclusions. So this step is also about justifying your study's existence. Why is your study needed? Why does this issue matter now? Who is affected by it? What new insight will your research contribute? So a strong problem statement answers all of these questions with clarity and with purpose. So as you develop your own study, ask yourself, does my research problem fill a real gap in the literature? Can I find those 3 to 5 sources that are current scholarly peer-reviewed sources from within just the last couple of years that say that this problem needs to be studied? Can it be measured and tested using data? Is it focused enough to lead to specific research questions? And if you can confidently say yes to those, then you're not just starting a study, you're actually building a foundation for research that can truly make a difference. So once you've defined a solid research problem, the next critical step is to translate that problem into precise research questions and testable hypotheses. So think of your research questions and hypotheses as the compass for your entire study. They point the way forward and help to ensure that every decision you make is aligned and it's intentional. Strong research questions are specific, measurable, and they are directly connected to the research problem. So in your dissertation, you're actually going to use the same terms in your research problem, in your research purpose, and in your research questions. So those terms should be very, very, very similar all the way through those statements. They shouldn't be too broad, and they should not be too abstract. Instead, they should clearly define what you're trying to learn, prove, or to understand. In quantitative research, they must be structured in a way that elicits quantifiable responses, making it possible to use statistics to interpret your results. So your research questions and your hypotheses, they're going to set up the statistical procedures that you're going to use. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But let's talk about the hypotheses. When you're working with quantitative data, hypotheses are not just helpful, they are essential. A null hypothesis typically states that there is no effect or no relationship between variables, and observed differences are assumed to be due to chance. On the other hand, the alternative hypothesis proposes that there is a relationship or an effect that is worth testing. And clearly defining these hypotheses ensures that your study remains objective and hypothesis-driven rather than unfocused or overly explanatory. And when they're well constructed, the hypotheses set you up for choosing the right statistical tools. For example, if you are comparing two groups, a t-test might be appropriate. Comparing more than two, then you might be looking at an ANOVA. If you're looking for relationships between variables, then you might be looking at a correlation or a regression analysis. But you can only select the correct test if your research questions and your hypotheses are precisely defined and logically structured. So you can see we have a problem, and then we have your research design, which is going to be part of your purpose statement, and then we're leading to your research questions, and then that's all of that in your hypotheses, which is leading to your statistical test. So all of this has a nice structured format to it, and that's really what you get into in building a quantitative research project. Now, by guiding analysis, hypotheses also support rigor and replicability. They help to keep the study grounded in data-driven decision-making, minimizing subjectivity and increasing the reliability of your findings. And remember, just because your hypothesis is not supported doesn't mean that your study failed. Even null results can offer valuable insight if your research design is strong. So it's important to think about confounding variables too. Those are sneaky factors that might influence your results without you even realizing it. And a well-structured hypothesis helps you to identify and control for these variables, ensuring that your conclusions are accurate and meaningful. And when your research questions and hypotheses are carefully crafted, they do more than just guide the process. They elevate the entire study. They lead to research that is valid, reliable, and actionable, contributing to the kind of evidence-based practice that drives real-world progress in education, healthcare, business, and beyond. So now that you've defined your problem and you've crafted your questions and hypotheses, it's time to make one of the most strategic decisions in the entire research process, and that is selecting your research design. So think of your research design as the blueprint for your study. It lays out exactly how you're going to collect your data and how you will analyze it and how you will interpret what it all means. Just like building a building project needs a solid blueprint in order to avoid chaos. Your research needs a clear design in order to stay focused, valid, and meaningful. So a well-chosen design does more than just organize your process. It ensures that your research questions, your hypotheses, and your study objectives are aligned from start to finish. It directly impacts the validity, which is how well your study measures what it claims to, the reliability, the consistency of your findings, and the generalizability, how applicable your results are to other settings. And then we break down a few of the most common used designs in quantitative research. So we have experimental research, and that's really the go-to if you're looking to test causation. In experiments, you manipulate one or more independent variables to see how they affect a dependent variable. And then you control from outside influences, often using random assignment, so that you can isolate the effect that you're testing. And the most rigorous version of this would be randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. And these are widely used in healthcare, education, and psychology to assess the effectiveness of treatments or interventions. Now, another type of research design would be correlational research, and that examines the relationship between variables without manipulating them. And this approach is especially useful when the experimental designs aren't feasible for ethical, logical, or logistical or practical reasons, like studying socioeconomic status and academic performance in real-world or school settings. But here's the key takeaway. Correlation does not equal causation. Just because two variables are associated does not mean that one necessarily causes the other. Another common design is descriptive research, which focuses on observing and summarizing characteristics of a group or phenomenon. It doesn't test relationships or cause and effect, but instead provides valuable insight into what is happening in a specific context. And then there's quasi-experimental designs, and these look and feel a lot like experiments, but they do not have random assignment. And these are often used in real-world settings like schools or clinic where random assignment isn't possible. And while they can still offer important findings, they may introduce selection bias, so interpretation has to be done with care. Ultimately, each design has its own strengths and its own trade-offs, and that's why it's so important to choose a design that not only fits your research questions, but it also aligns with your available resources, your time frame, your ethical considerations, and your access to your participants. So when you choose the right design, you're not just checking off a box saying, I chose a research design. You're setting up your study for success. You're ensuring that your findings are methodologically sound, statistically valid, and capable of answering the questions that you have set out to explore. Okay, variables. So this one's a pretty lengthy slide here. So once you've chosen your research design, the next step is to get crystal clear on your variables, because these are the moving parts of your study. These are what you're going to collect data on. Variables are essentially the measurable characteristics or conditions that can change, and they are the building blocks of any quantitative research project. And so when we define the variables correctly and precisely, we lay the groundwork for producing valid, reliable, and statistically accurate results. In quantitative research, variables fall into a few key categories that you want to get very comfortable with. We have the independent variables, and these are the variables that you can manipulate or the cause in any cause and effect relationship, and you're changing those to see what happens. And then you have the dependent variables, and these are the outcomes that you are measuring. They respond to the changes in the independent variables. And then you have the control variables, and these are the factors that you are deliberately keeping constant so that they don't interfere with your results. And then you might have extraneous or confounding variables. And these variables, they are the wild cards, the variables that aren't necessarily of primary interest, but can still influence your results if they're not accounted for. Confounding variables in particular can make it look like there's an effect when there really isn't, or they can hide a real effect that's occurring. And so here's a quick example of understanding confounding variables. Let's say you want to study whether energy drink consumption affects academic performance. Well, your independent variable would be energy drink use, and your dependent variable might be GPA or test scores. Well, suppose that students who drink more energy drinks tend to have lower grades. Well, you might think energy drinks are the cause. But what if those students are also sleeping less? Well, sleep would be the confounding variable, and it's linked to both energy drink use and academic performance. And if we don't control for it, then we might wrongly blame the energy drinks when the real issue could be the lack of sleep. That's why identifying confounding variables is essential, because they can distort the true relationship between the variables and lead to misleading conclusions. So here's the key. For your results to be statistically meaningful, your variables must be operationalized. And all that means is defining them in very clear, measurable terms. So let's say you want to measure for your study intelligence. Well, that's a very complex and abstract concept. So to operationalize it, you might define in your study that you are going to use scores from a specific standardized IQ test. Now, instead of something vague, you have a quantifiable measure that can be analyzed statistically, and you have just explained how you're going to measure that in your specific study. Without clear operational definitions, your study risks measurement errors, inconsistent results, and poor replicability, and that can weaken your conclusions. You also need to consider the level of measurement for each variable. Is the level of measurement nominal, meaning the categories have no specific order like gender or marital status? Is it ordinal, categories with a ranked order but unequal spacing like a Likert scale? Interval, numeric scales with equals intervals but no true zero? Or ratio, numeric scales with a true 0 point like weight or age? These levels are critical because they determine what statistical tests are appropriate for your data. For example, you would not use a t-test on nominal data. in short, the clearer you are about your variables, the stronger your research is going to be. So when you define, categorize, and operationalize your variables thoughtfully, you ensure that your results are reliable, generalizable, and meaningful, and that your conclusions are going to hold up under scrutiny. So that's really just the key here. And you don't really need to know all of these terms. You can always look them up. You will need to know them when you write your quantitative research project. But as you go through them, just think through them, and then make sure that you define them very clearly in your own project. That is the key there, is to become familiar with them and to specify them very clearly. Okay, so now that we've discussed variables, let's move on to a question that is central to the integrity of your study. Who exactly are you going to study, and how are you going to choose them? Well, the sampling method that you select is going to have a direct impact on the validity, the generalizability, and the reliability of your findings. In other words, it determines how much trust others can place in your results and whether your conclusions can be applied beyond the people that you actually surveyed or tested. In any research project, your population is the full group you've tested that you're interested in learning about, and that your sample is the smaller group that you actually study. A well-designed sampling strategy ensures that your sample is representative of the larger population so that your findings are more than just a reflection of a specific group. They are useful on a broader scale. So in quantitative research, you have two primary categories of sampling. So you have probability, and then you have non-probability sampling. Now, probability is really the gold standard for generalizability. In probability sampling, every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected, which minimizes bias and supports strong statistical inference. And here are some common types. You have simple random sampling. Every individual has an equal opportunity of being chosen. It's like just picking names out of a hat, but digitally. Then you have stratified sampling. The population is divided into subgroups. Maybe they're divided by age or gender, and participants are randomly selected from each group. And this ensures that key groups are represented. And then you have systematic sampling. You select every nth person from a list. For example, you might select every 10th name from a particular directory or list. Then you have probability sampling. It enhances the study's external validity, not internal, external, meaning that your results can be confidently generalized to the larger population. Now, non-probability sampling is used because, let's face it, sometimes random sampling isn't always possible. Sometimes there are time constraints, there are budget constraints, there are access limitations that force us to use non-probability sampling methods. These methods are more convenient, but there are some trade-offs. Namely, there is limited generalizability and a higher risk of sampling bias. So a few common types are convenience sampling, where you work with whoever is readily available, and that might be university students or co-workers. Purposive sampling. You select participants based upon specific criteria that are relevant to your research topic. For example, you only interview teachers who have used a certain curriculum. Well, maybe that's just the best fit for your research topic. It might be. Then there's something like snowball sampling. Participants help recruit others, and this is often used when studying hard-to-reach populations, like people with a rare condition or members of a specific community. And these approaches can still yield valuable insights, but they might require careful documentation and transparency, because researchers need to be upfront about the limitations, particularly regarding generalizability and bias. And the key takeaway is that there's really no one-size-fits-all approach. Your sampling method must align with your research goals, available resources, the population characteristics, and when it's done well, a thoughtful sampling plan not only enhances the credibility of your study, it also ensures that your findings are both statistically valid and practically meaningful. So let's just pause for a moment and we'll just reflect on what we've covered so far. We've walked through the first 5 foundational steps of planning a quantitative study, from defining your research problem all the way to selecting your sampling strategy. So here's a question for you. Of these first 5 steps, and you can just reply in the chat, which one do you personally find to be the most challenging in your own research project, and why? Is it narrowing down a measurable problem, crafting precise research questions and hypotheses, choosing the right design, or identifying and defining the variables, or selecting a sampling method that fits your research goals and just the real world time constraints. There we go. Think about where you have felt stuck or uncertain or overwhelmed, and then be ready to share how you've approached it or ask questions that might help you to move forward. There are no wrong answers here. Every researcher hits bumps in the road, and this is just a chance to share any strategies or ideas or honest experiences that you've had. And if anyone has any ideas for what would make a step easier or any strategies that you have found helpful, you are welcome to share that too.
Looks like we have real world time constraints, choosing the right design, crafting the properly worded research questions, some of the things that we've discussed.
Okay.
And there was a question about the 5 steps. Just so everyone knows, you will get a copy of the presentation. We did have some late joiners as well too, just so everyone's in the know.
Yeah, the real world time constraints, though, that's really a big one because you do have to plan this study that you're doing, and keep all of these factors and elements in mind. And you're also trying to do that too. If it's a dissertation that you're planning, then you're doing that on the time frame for your dissertation as well. And so that is something to keep in mind. And the problem statement and the purpose statement for the dissertation, I always say, are the two most frequently revised sections of the dissertation because they are so critical. And of course, the purpose statement is where you're selecting your research design, right? And then the problem statement is what the whole study hinges on. So those are constantly revised. So we're always always reworking and revising those. But if you can really start with a very strong problem statement, and again, the discussion, limitations, and recommendations for future research, those are the key areas to pay attention to in existing literature when you're planning that problem statement. Look at what the literature says needs to be studied and build your topic from there. It is much easier to approach a dissertation topic that way. All right. So we've identified your variables and know that, and you know what you want to measure. And the next big question is, how exactly are you going to measure it? In quantitative research, your tools, whether they're surveys, questionnaires, rating scales, or standardized tests, are only as good as their ability to measure what they're supposed to measure. And that's where instrument validation comes in. And using validated instruments is absolutely essential. So because that enhances the credibility, the reliability, and the validity of your entire study. If your instrument is flawed, it doesn't matter how well you execute the rest of your research, the data will be questionable from the start. A validated instrument is one that has already been tested and shown to produce consistent and accurate results across different settings, so we're studying samples and settings. And when you use established and validated instruments, you reduce the risk of measurement error, and your findings can be more easily compared to previous research. That says sometimes an instrument just doesn't fit. Maybe you're exploring a new topic, you're working with a unique population, or your research question demands a different angle. In that case, you might need to develop your own instrument, but that means taking on responsibility of rigorous testing to make sure that it meets accepted standards. If you're working on a dissertation, it is recommended that you use existing quantitative instruments with published reliability and validity rather than developing your own instruments, because that validation process can be very lengthy. And before using a new instrument in your study, it is critical to pilot test it. That means running a small scale trial with a similar sample to assess its clarity, effectiveness, and reliability. And this step can help you catch any confusing questions, any ambiguous responses, or any technical issues before they compromise your real data. And also keep in mind that even if you're planning to adapt a new instrument, say changing the wording of some items or using the item in a different language than it was published in, then you would still need to retest it for validity. Even small changes can affect how people can interpret or respond to items, which in turn would affect your results. And if you skip this step or use a poorly tested tool, then you run the risk of collecting biased, inconsistent, or misleading data. And that can lead to flawed conclusions, no matter how sophisticated your analysis might be. So the takeaway is, for a dissertation, Be sure that you're using existing instruments with published reliability and validity. It will save you a lot of time. And I will share a resource on where you can actually find those instruments toward the end of the presentation. And whether you're selecting an established instrument or you're planning to create your own, a new one from scratch, use a well-chosen, well-tested instrument is going to give you the confidence that what you're measuring is real, reliable, and ready to be trusted. And be very precise in choosing your instruments for your study. Now, at this point, we're on step 7, and you have built a strong foundation. Your research problem is clear, your questions are sharp, and your variables and instruments are set. But it's time to bring the study to life through data collection, which I think is the fun part. But it's also the part that requires meticulous planning. Effective research planning isn't just about staying organized. It's about making sure that your study is conducted accurately, ethically, and efficiently. A well-structured plan helps to minimize errors and enhance data reliability and maintain the highest ethical standards. When planning is weak or rushed, researchers risk encountering serious pitfalls like biased results, incomplete data sets, or ethical violations that can derail the entire study or undermine its credibility. And careful planning, on the other hand, keeps the process smooth and defensible. So we'll talk about one major benefit of planning, which would be error prevention. Mistakes in design, sampling, measurement, or analysis can lead to misleading or invalid conclusions, which can be especially damaging in high-stakes fields like healthcare, education, or public policy. So how do we avoid that? Here are a few best practices. Clearly define your research objectives and hypotheses before collecting any data. This helps to keep your study focused. Select the right design and sampling strategy to minimize bias and increase representativeness. Conduct a pilot test. This is a small-scale trial, again, that can help you identify any unclear instructions, any ambiguous questions, or technical issues before they affect the actual data. But planning isn't just a technical task, it's also an ethical responsibility. Researchers must protect participants and uphold the principles of respect, justice, and beneficence throughout the process. And some essential ethical safeguards include informed consent. Participants must fully understand the purpose of the study, any risks, and their rights before agreeing to take part. Confidentiality, protecting all personal data, minimization of harm. Your study should never expose participants, of course, to any physical, emotional, or social risks that are unnecessary. And IRB approval. If you're conducting research with human subjects, you will need to get approval from an institutional review board, which reviews ethical compliance. And let's not forget replicability and transparency. Solid research is not just done well, it is documented well too. And that means recording your procedures in enough detail that other researchers can replicate or verify your findings. And without that, even the great study loses credibility. So these are all just important things to consider. Now that you've designed your study, you've defined your variables, and you've chosen your instruments, you're ready to answer the big question of, what do I do with all of this data that once I collected? And this is where your data analysis plan comes into play, and choosing the right statistical test is absolutely essential. And you want to make sure that your analysis not only matches your research questions and your hypotheses, but it also aligns with the type of data that you have gathered and your overall study design. So think of your statistical tests as the tools in your toolbox. These are three of the most widely used tools in quantitative research: t-test, ANOVA, and regression analysis. But let's look a little bit closer at each one of these. So t-tests are often used if you're comparing two groups. They help you to answer the questions, are the averages or means of these two groups significantly different from each other? They're often used in education, psychology, and healthcare to compare the outcomes between two independent or related samples. There are two main types. You have the independent t-test, which is used when comparing two separate groups and paired t-test, which is used when comparing the same group at two different points in time. And then t-tests also assume that your data are normally distributed and that both groups have equal variances. And if those assumptions don't hold, then there might be some other tests that you need to run, like non-parametric tests. And I'm not going to go into those in detail here, but there are resources available to help you choose the statistical tests. And again, I will share those toward the end of the presentation. Now, ANOVA is useful if you're comparing 3 or more groups. If you're dealing with more than two groups, A t-test isn't going to cut it, and that's really where you're going to use the ANOVA. It allows you to determine whether there are statistically significant differences among group means. And you might have a one-way ANOVA, which compares the means based upon a single independent variable. A two-way ANOVA examines the effects of two independent variables, as well as their interaction. A repeated measure ANOVA, which is used when the same participants are tested under different conditions or across multiple time points. And the significant ANOVA result tells you that at least one group differs, but it doesn't tell you which one. And then you might have some post hoc tests that need to be completed. And regression analysis. So if your goal is to understand how variables are related or to predict an outcome, then regression analysis might be your go-to method. It helps you to model the relationships and identify how much influence one or more variables have on a dependent variable. And so there are common types like simple linear regression, multiple regression, and logistic regression. And there's also, again, some assumptions that have to be checked for with each of these. So how do you choose the right test? Well, the choice depends on the number of groups that you're comparing, the level of measurement of your variables, the research questions that you're asking, and whether the assumptions for each test are met. And making the right choice ensures your findings are statistically valid and that they are relevant to your study's purpose. Choosing the wrong test can lead to misleading conclusions, no matter how good the study or the data are. So the key takeaway here is don't just run the numbers. Make sure you choose the test that matches your questions and your data. And if you're unsure, that's okay. Be sure to reach out to a statistician, your dissertation chair, or revisit these core principles. And when your analysis is aligned with your research design, your hypotheses, and your data type, then that's when you're positioned to make a confidence evidence-based conclusion on your findings. So no matter how well you plan your research, every study hits some roadblocks. It doesn't matter if you're a first-time grad student or a seasoned scholar, challenges are just part of the process. And here are some good news. The most successful researchers are not the ones who avoid problems altogether, but they're the ones who anticipate them early and build contingency plans into their design from the start. So when you think ahead, you're not just troubleshooting, you're safeguarding the integrity of your study and protecting participants and upholding the rigor of your research. So let's just take a look at some of the common pitfalls in quantitative research, and more importantly, how you can stay one step ahead. Sampling issues, you might get a lower response rate or a sample that isn't representative of the one that you had originally chose. Measurement and instrumentation errors, data collection and ethical concerns. Sometimes participants might drop out, or maybe they have technical issues like internet connections or incomplete responses. Like if you're doing a survey and they're not able to complete it for some reason, that can happen. Statistical and analytical problems. Your data may not always behave the way that the textbook says it should. Something like that. You may have to transform data. There might be those confounding variables that we talk about. So what can you do about it? Well, you can plan ahead. You can do pilot studies. You can diversify your recruitment. Don't just rely on one way to reach participants. You can use flyers, you can use email lists, you can class visits, social media, or even in-person invitations. So plan your recruitment strategies for your study to make sure that you're going to be able to reach the population that you would need to for your study. Include statistical safeguards. Like planning for missing data. You might have to use things like multiple imputation to avoid bias, that's a multiple imputation fills in missing values by creating several complete versions of your data set based upon patterns that it finds in the data. It doesn't just guess, it uses statistical modeling to make reasonable estimates while preserving the uncertainty. And if your data violate assumptions, be ready to transform variables. And again, you may need to run non-parametric tests that don't rely on strict assumptions or transform the data using logs or square roots. So this is where you're going to need the help of a statistician to help assist you with this. So don't be afraid to reach out to those resources. The bottom line is planning for problems is planning for success. Planning for what could go wrong might not sound glamorous, but it's one of the most important things that you can do as a researcher. And when you anticipate potential obstacles, you reduce risk, protect your study's credibility and protect your participants. And you don't need a crystal ball, you just need a plan. So before you launch your next study, ask yourself, what could go wrong and what will I do if it does? And if you can answer these two questions, you're not just prepared, you're empowered for your next research project. So congratulations, you've made it to step 10, which is the final step in our 10-step journey. You planned your study, you've collected and analyzed your data, and now it's time to do something just as important, or maybe even more important. You want to report it clearly, ethically, and transparently. Why? Because the value of your research doesn't just stop at your findings. It extends to how well others can understand, trust, and build on your work. Transparent and replicable reporting is the cornerstone of high-quality research. It ensures that your findings are not just a one-time insight, but part of a larger cumulative scientific conversation. So let's walk through the key elements of a responsible, high-impact research reporting and how you can use them to strengthen the credibility and the usefulness of your work. So this might sound basic, but it's often overlooked. It's just making sure, again, that you clearly define your research questions and hypotheses, use a detailed methodology and data collection procedures, use accurate statistical analysis and interpretation. It's not enough to say we ran some stats. Your audience needs to know which statistical tests you used, why you chose them, what assumptions were met or violated, and the key statistics, the effect sizes, the confidence intervals, the significance values, and more. And you need to report all of the results, not just the ones that support your hypotheses, because non-significant findings are still meaningful. They help to reduce publication bias and to give you a more complete picture of the evidence. Report any ethical considerations and any issues with data transparency, and make sure that you share your de-identified data when possible, and addressing limitations and ensuring objectivity. Be upfront about your study's limitations and avoid overstating your findings. And last but not least, replicability is the hallmark of trustworthy research. Your findings should be reproducible by others using the same methods and data. If a study can't be replicated, then it raises questions about its reliability, about hidden bias or errors. So when researchers document their methods thoroughly, they share their data when possible, and report results transparently, they contribute to a scientific process that is self-correcting and is constantly improving. So the final takeaway is transparent reporting isn't about perfection, it's about openness, clarity, and accountability. And by embracing these values, you don't just complete a study, you add something meaningful to the broader knowledge base of your field. So as you wrap up your research, ask yourself, would someone else be able to replicate what I did? Have I been clear and fair about what I found and what I didn't? Have I told the whole story? And if the answer is yes, then you're not just reporting, you're contributing to a better, bolder, and more ethical science. So we'll just take a moment to go over these 10 steps very quickly. Define your research problem, establish your research questions and hypotheses, choose your research design, identify your variables, determine your population and sampling strategy, select measures and instruments, plan your data collection process, choose your data analysis techniques, anticipate potential challenges, and report and interpret results. And that's actually quite a bit. There's a lot to do in planning a research study, there really is. And these 10 steps are not just a checklist, they are a research mindset. When they are followed with care and intention, they help you to ensure that your study is not just methodologically strong, but that it makes a real contribution to your field. So as you leave today, take these steps with you, let them guide your process, let them anchor your thinking, and let them inspire your next great research idea. You've got this, so go and build something meaningful. Before we wrap up, I want to just direct you to a few incredible resources that we have that are available to help you. They will truly make a difference as you plan and complete your research. I'm going to start with statistics support from the Academic Success Center. If you're feeling uncertain about the statistics resources or about statistics and data analysis, you're not alone. Our Academic Success Center has some wonderful resources. They also offer writing support. And there's a reason that the Academic Success Center personnel are regularly mentioned in the acknowledgement sections of the dissertations that I chair, is because they're so helpful. I see that a lot. And the next up is the library. The library is just a place to borrow books. It's a research powerhouse, and you can find instruments for quantitative research there. And it's likely where you're going to be going to find your journal articles. And just don't be afraid to ask a librarian. They can probably assist you in finding the information that you're looking for too. Again, they have the tests and measurements for quantitative research you're going to find there as well. And the bottom line is you're not expected to do this alone. These resources are here to support you, so be sure to use them early and often. And before we close, if you've been through these 10 steps and just think for a moment, is there one insider strategy that just really stuck with you today? Something that would you're feeling a little bit more confident about? Just take a moment to think about what resonated with you, and feel free to share it with the group or just write it down for yourself. Even with just one powerful shift in perspective can elevate the quality of your research and your confidence as a scholar. So let's hear it. What's one thing you're taking from this presentation with you today?
And Dr. Marvel, while people go ahead and put that in the chat, I will just mention, someone had said, thank you so much for this intro. Oh, I'm so sorry. Hopefully you don't hear that noise that was outside. Hopefully that wasn't too distracting. Okay, good. I know some people are putting their thoughts in the chat. There's no way around it. Trying to cover 10 steps for quantitative research for you to be successful in your journey in 1 hour is quite a feat. So Dr. Marvel, thank you so much for this session. A lot of detail. So keep in mind here too, that we can always come back to the skill up. You can pause it. You'll have access to the PowerPoint as well too. So you'll have time where you can come back to it. So many people are saying thank you so much. This is really wonderful to go through, that they learned a lot from today's session and some insightful things about strategies that really stuck with them today. I did want to point out, Dr. Marvel had mentioned the resources in the Academic Success Center. I can't speak more highly of that. Someone had mentioned, hey, how do I get one-on-one help? That if you're looking to get assistance outside of your faculty member at NU, I would highly recommend going to the Academic Success Center and even just starting with a chat, because then you can ask more questions and they can point you to the right resources. And I hope this helped give you a little bit of information, depending on your research journey as quantitative researchers, to help guide you as you're navigating what certainly is the journey of a lifetime. And without anything else to say, I just want to thank you, Dr. Marvel. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you all for attending.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good
Thank you,
evening.
everyone.